This is a tale that enslaved women whispered to their daughters when their owners weren't listening. Like all stories passed through generations, some details may have grown larger over time, others faded into memory, and parts may have been changed to make the message stronger. But the heart of it remains true. In the early hours of December 31st, 1859, a woman named Sarah decided it was time to settle a debt written in blood. Before we dive deeper, I want you to do something for me. Hit that subscribe button right now and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. It really helps the Archive of Fear grow, and I love seeing where our community reaches across the globe. This story comes from fragments, whispers from those who escaped that night, accounts from Jacob Anderson, the youngest brother who lived through it, and memories kept alive in songs sung in the fields that moved from one generation to the next. Two souls who had lost everything learned that having nothing left made them more deadly than any weapon. The final sunrise of 1859 in Richmond, Virginia brought no celebration, only the quiet destruction of an empire built on human misery. A night when justice carved its own path through the shadows. This is among the most chilling tales of vengeance and resistance I've encountered from the era of American slavery. A story proving that some people forge their own justice when the world refuses to give it. What occurred on the Patterson estate that dawn changed forever how Richmond understood power. Because when you shatter a person completely, sometimes they don't simply crumble. Sometimes they reconstruct themselves into something far more dangerous. The Patterson estate sprawled across 60 acres beside the James River, but its true wealth didn't flow from the soil. It came from trading human lives, transformed into an operation that ran with cold, mechanical efficiency. Marcus Patterson had inherited an ordinary plantation from his father, but at 55 years old, he'd turned it into something darker. What traders across Virginia quietly called the Academy, a place where rebellious, enslaved people were sent by owners throughout the state to be educated. The property was carved into sections of horror. Cotton fields provided respectable cover. The real business happened in less visible structures. Isolation cabins where people were kept in darkness for weeks, converted stables where young women were forced to breed like livestock, and a basement where the most resistant cases faced methods that defied imagination. Marcus kept leather journals recording his experiments with scientific detail. He developed theories about psychological breaking points and tested them with clinical coldness. Some were deprived of sleep for days until they hallucinated. Others forced into painful positions for hours. Some exposed to constant noise that pushed them toward madness. His methods included what he termed correction through silence. Captives kept in mute, dark cells, fed only watery gruel at random intervals until they lost all sense of time and reality. Some emerged as obedient automatons. Others never recovered their minds. Marcus had built a system where enslaved people were forced to report on each other's conversations, creating webs of paranoia that destroyed any possibility of unity. Children were trained from infancy to watch their own parents, rewarded with extra food when they reported suspicious behavior. The basement had been converted into a laboratory of human suffering. Marcus kept instruments he'd designed himself, iron devices applying gradual pressure to specific body points, causing agony without leaving visible scars. There was also a reflection chair, where people were bound in positions that became unbearable after hours. His three oldest sons had been raised in this environment, each developing distinct specialties in cruelty. Richard, the firstborn at 30, was known for physical strength and direct methods. He'd created the reflection room, a space where people were hung by their wrists, forced to balance on toes to avoid dislocating shoulders. Richard watched carefully, studying how long each person could resist before losing consciousness. He'd specialized in torture, leaving no permanent visible marks, allowing corrected slaves to be sold without evidence of abuse. His techniques included pressure on specific nerve points, causing agony without marks. Thomas, at 27, preferred psychologically refined techniques. He'd studied writings on mental alienation and adapted these theories for treating enslaved people. His specialty was breaking will without breaking body, using isolation and emotional manipulation to transform rebels into collaborators in their own oppression. Thomas had created a system where enslaved people competed for minor privileges: an extra spoonful of food, a less filthy blanket, 5 more minutes of rest. This competition transformed solidarity into rivalry. He forced parents to choose which children would be punished, mothers to decide which child would receive food, creating guilt and self-hatred lasting generations. The third son, at 22, was pure sadistic unpredictability. He collected trophies from his victims, pulled teeth, locks of hair, small personal items kept in a special box in his room, organized by date with notes about how he obtained them. Sarah's world of horror. Sarah knew every detail of this horror because she'd been cleaning the main house for 8 years. She'd been purchased as a child along with Emma, her younger sister, after their parents died in a fire at a neighboring plantation. During her years in the main house, she'd witnessed horrors beyond human comprehension. She cleaned blood from walls after educational sessions, collected pulled teeth from wooden floors, washed torn clothing telling stories of unspeakable violence. She developed an empty, almost catatonic expression that protected her from the madness consuming other enslaved people exposed to the same horrors. It was a survival mask, hiding a mind that absorbed and cataloged every atrocity. Emma, her younger sister at 17, worked in the laundry where bloodied clothes regularly arrived to be cleaned. She developed special techniques for removing different types of stains: fresh blood, dried blood, other bodily fluids. It was grim knowledge no young woman should possess. The sisters met briefly each night at the property's edge, sharing whispers of encouragement, trying to keep alive a spark of humanity. They spoke of their mother who died of exhaustion in the fields, of impossible dreams of freedom, places where people like them could walk without chains. December 1858 brought cold that penetrated to bone and a proposal that would change two sisters' fate forever. Sarah was cleaning Marcus's office when he called her for a conversation she'd never forget. The proposal Marcus presented was wrapped in civilized language, but its essence was pure barbarism. Sarah should participate in the estate's breeding program, producing a child who'd be sold after weaning. In exchange, he promised to sell both her and Emma to a family in the north. Quakers, perhaps, people known for treating their workers with relative kindness. The breeding program operated in special cabins Marcus had built at the property's rear. Selected women were kept isolated from the rest of the enslaved population, connected to a central system where Marcus could monitor all activities. When Sarah finally accepted the proposal, she did so with clear understanding that she was making a pact with the devil. But it was a pact offering the only chance of freedom she and Emma might have. It was a desperate bet on an uncertain future, but better than certainty of lifelong slavery. What she didn't know was that the true purpose of the program had never been producing children for sale. It was to break young women so completely they'd become incapable of future resistance. The promise of freedom was just bait to lure victims into systematic psychological destruction. January 1859 brought snow and the arrival of a man, Marcus, introduced with a false name. Sarah immediately knew something was wrong. This man was too young, too thin, and his eyes carried terror of someone recently broken. What followed over the coming months was systematic abuse, disguised as a breeding program. Sarah was subjected to controlled nutrition, random wake-ups for unnecessary examinations, and constant psychological manipulation designed to break any remaining sense of dignity. In the 6th month of pregnancy, the inevitable happened. Marcus had deliberately increased Sarah's physical work, forcing her to carry excessive weight, work long hours under scorching sun, continue even when visibly exhausted. It was deliberate induction of miscarriage, disguised as operational necessity. Emma found her 2 hours later, unconscious in a pool of blood. The child had been born dead, too small, too weak to survive the brutal conditions deliberately imposed by Marcus. When Sarah woke 3 days later, the first thing she saw was Emma's face, swollen from crying. The second was Marcus standing at the bed's foot, his cold eyes studying her like an experiment, producing interesting but inconclusive results. It was at that moment something fundamental changed inside Sarah. Not hope, that had died with the baby. It was something deeper. The part of her that still believed human beings had limits to cruelty died that day. But she showed nothing externally. She'd learned that survival on the Patterson estate depended on never revealing true thoughts or feelings. What Marcus didn't realize was that by destroying the last spark of hope in Sarah, he'd created something far more dangerous. He'd created someone with nothing left to lose. During the months following the loss, Sarah met Daniel, the property's blacksmith, a 35-year-old man whose imposing presence masked sharp intelligence and patience, forged over 15 years of careful observation. The forge where Daniel worked was a world apart within the property. As blacksmith, he had access to all areas. He needed to repair locks, fix bars, maintain equipment in all buildings. This unique position allowed him to observe and memorize every detail, every entrance, every exit, every weak point in security, every behavioral pattern of the Patterson family. The loss that had shaped Daniel was the sale of his daughter Grace, an 8-year-old girl sold to a sugar plantation in Louisiana when Marcus decided she was developing undesirable characteristics. She'd inherited her father's intelligence and begun asking questions that bothered overseers. Their first conversations were apparently innocent, discussions about work, weather, small details of daily life. But beneath these simple words, mutual understanding began forming. Both recognized in the other someone who'd seen beyond the illusions keeping most enslaved people functioning. Daniel began working on a special project in his forge. Using iron from old horseshoes and oak wood hardened by time, he forged a heavy blade with a long handle. The weapon he created was not exactly an axe nor a sword, but something between, a tool that could be wielded with devastating force but would pass unnoticed as work equipment. More importantly, he designed the weapon to be used by two people working in coordination. It was a physical metaphor for the alliance he and Sarah had formed, stronger together than either could be alone. As 1859 drew to a close, the sisters' anxiety about Marcus's promise grew. They'd fulfilled their part. Sarah had become pregnant as required, and both had worked without complaints. The morning of December 31st, 1859, dawned cold and clear. The sisters were called to the main courtyard at 7 a.m., and Sarah immediately knew the moment of truth had arrived. Marcus spoke about the agreement with cruel eloquence perfected over decades. He explained how Sarah had failed by not producing a healthy child, and how only Emma would be sold to the North as promised. When Emma protested, reminding them the agreement was for both, the Patterson brothers laughed with casual cruelty. Richard explained the agreement was what his father said it was, nothing more. Then Richard drew out a special whip, not the common one used for routine discipline, but one with metal tips he reserved for demonstrations. When he announced Emma had tried to escape and would be punished as an example, Sarah knew she was about to witness her sister's murder. What followed was calculated cruelty, surpassing even the brutal standards of the Patterson property. Richard whipped Emma with scientific precision, each blow calculated to maximize pain without causing immediate death. At 20 blows, Emma collapsed on frozen ground, but was still breathing. Richard continued to 40 blows, far beyond what was necessary to cause death. When Sarah was released and ran to Emma, she found her sister still alive, but only for moments. Emma's last words were whispered with determination cutting through pain. "Don't let them win." Marcus approached the body, casually commenting that now Sarah had no one, that this should make her more cooperative. But when Sarah raised her eyes to him, something in her gaze made Marcus instinctively step back. It wasn't despair or resignation. It was lethal coldness promising terrible consequences. There was no New Year's party that year. Marcus had canceled planned celebrations, citing cold weather and business matters. The house remained silent with only family and domestic slaves present. It was exactly what Sarah and Daniel needed. At 10 p.m., Sarah met Daniel at the property's rear, near where Emma had been buried in a shallow, unmarked grave. Their eyes met for exactly 3 seconds, the signal they'd established. It was time to transform weeks of planning into lethal action. They started with the youngest son, most unpredictable when sober but most vulnerable when drunk. Daniel waited for him in darkness, positioned with patience of a predator who'd waited 15 years. The blade descended with force of decades of repressed rage, striking at the skull's base before he could turn or scream. Thomas was next, isolated in his private office conducting his obsessive ritual with money. Sarah entered silently, carrying a tray with bourbon and glass, as if attending to a request. Thomas briefly raised his eyes, nodded in automatic recognition, and returned attention to money he was counting. He never saw Daniel emerge from shadows behind him. Richard was returning from the stables when they intercepted him in the corridor. He saw Daniel first, noticed blood on the blade, and his hand went instinctively to the pistol on his belt. But Sarah was behind him, positioned with precision of someone who'd studied his movements for years. She held his arms, immobilizing him with strength that surprised even Daniel. Years of brutal physical work had given Sarah steel muscles under her fragile appearance. Marcus Patterson was alone in his office when they arrived, reviewing contracts by flickering candlelight. He raised his eyes when the door opened, expecting to see one of his sons. Instead, he saw Sarah and Daniel, the latter carrying a blade dripping blood from three men who'd believed themselves invincible. For a moment suspended in time, Marcus looked at them slowly, processing what he was seeing. Then, surprisingly, he smiled. Not with fear, but with something like professional admiration. "Well," he said, his voice calm despite circumstances, "I suppose I underestimated you." Sarah took the blade Daniel offered her. It was heavier than expected, but fit perfectly in her hands. "This is for Emma," she whispered, raising the blade, "and for Grace, and for all the others whose names we never knew." The blade descended for the last time that night, forever silencing the voice that had ordered so much suffering, that had transformed human beings into merchandise, that had created an empire of systematic degradation. When it was finished, Sarah and Daniel remained silent in the bloodied office, surrounded by documents representing decades of human commerce. They worked quickly, systematically. Sale documents were burned in the fireplace. Money from the safe was left for enslaved people who chose to remain. Keys to shackles were given to those with courage to use them. When the distant church bell rang at midnight, announcing 1860's arrival, the Patterson property was symbolically in flames. The buildings remained intact, but everything the family had built, their control system, their business network, their reputation for invincibility, was being systematically destroyed. They were last to leave, walking together to Emma's grave where Sarah knelt one final time. "It's done," she whispered to the frozen earth. "They paid, all of them, and now you can rest." They disappeared into the frozen darkness of New Year's dawn, following routes Daniel had identified during his years on the property. They were never captured, despite efforts of local authorities. The story of Sarah and Daniel spread through slave quarters like fire through dry straw, but not a simple revenge tale. It was a complex narrative about planning, patience, and systematic application of justice, where the legal system had completely failed. It was whispered in work songs that seemed innocent to white ears, but carried coded messages for those who knew how to listen. It was passed from mother to daughter as a promise that even the most powerful could fall, even the most silent could roar, even the most broken could rise up. The Patterson property never recovered. Without leadership, without documentation, without the fear keeping the system functioning, it collapsed within months. Jacob Patterson, the youngest brother who'd survived by studying at a military academy in North Carolina, returned to find his family dead and his inheritance in ruins. Instead of trying to rebuild the empire of suffering, he formally freed all remaining enslaved people and dedicated the rest of his life to documenting the truth about what his family had done. Some versions of the legend say Sarah and Daniel found freedom in the North, living simple but dignified lives under false names. Others whisper they settled in a community of fugitive slaves, helping others find the path to freedom. Some tell they returned to the South years later during the Civil War to fight for abolition. But all versions agree on one thing. They never regretted what they did that night. Because when the system fails to provide justice, when the law protects oppressors instead of victims, when mercy becomes a luxury only the powerful can afford, sometimes the only answer is to forge your own justice in the fire of necessity. The legend doesn't end with a happy ending in the conventional sense, but with something more powerful. Proof that even in the most desperate circumstances, even against the most oppressive systems, human dignity can be recovered through decisive action. True freedom doesn't come from broken chains, but from spirits refusing to be broken. If this story from the Archive of Fear moved you, hit that subscribe button, leave your thoughts in the comments, and share it with others who need to hear these forgotten voices from history. Because some stories aren't just entertainment. They're reminders that courage can flourish in the most unlikely places, and justice, even when delayed, is never denied forever.